A pitch, as we often think about it, is either a group of people in a room with the PowerPoint slides, or it's the dreaded elevator pitch, where it's two
Mm.
people and it's very clear, oh, I want something from you, and maybe I can convince you with my words in the next 30 seconds. This 20th century industrial age idea that PowerPoint is always the way to go. And the more robotic and the more jargon laden you speak, the more convincing you are. I think that maybe was successful in the 20th century. But with modern audiences, gosh, good luck. LinkedIn said for the last few years, communication is actually the number one skill in business. It's what gets you hired. And this is even more true for people higher up the ranks. I talk a lot about the controlling the 10%. Studies show that 90% of what you say will be forgotten next week. That means you want to be very clear what your 10% are. Be cool, be helpful, be flexible. I think if you use that as your compass, you're already achieving more than 99.9% of people.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Pitch Masters with me, your host, Danny Fontaine, aka The Pitch Guy. And this week I have a very special guest. He's helped over 300 founders and CEOs master their voice. His name is Oliver Aust. He's a best-selling author. He's a TEDx speaker, and he's the founder of Speak Like a CEO, the academy, the methodology, and the podcast. He also happens to be the ex-CMO of easyJet. And I remember in the 90s when easyJet was launched, and it was one of the most disruptive brands, the most disruptive business models out there. And boy, does Oliver have a lot of stories to tell. We also talk about anti-fragility, we talk about nerves, confidence, impacts, pitch frameworks, all of that brilliant stuff, as well as my favorite topic, some of Oliver's real pitching horror stories. So if you like the episode, if you like the podcast, please take a second to like, to subscribe, to comment. It really makes a difference. And don't forget, my book is available across the world. Pitch: How to Captivate and Convince Any Audience on the Planet. But enough of that. Let's crack on with the episode. So sit back, relax, get ready to take some notes. Oliver, what an absolute honor to have you on the podcast. It's great to see you. I'm going to ask you the first question I ask all my guests, which is, how do you pitch yourself?
Great question, Danny. Thanks for having me. So my pitch is usually to say, hey, I'm Oliver Aust. I help leaders become top 1% communicators so they can achieve what they want in life and in business.
Fantastic. Short and sweet. But I know that beyond what you do now, you've had an incredibly interesting career up to this moment. So take a couple of minutes. Tell me a little bit about your story from where you were and how you got to where you were today.
Yeah, so I'm based in Berlin. I'm German, but I spent a lot of my professional life abroad. Essentially back in the 1990s, the days of Tony Blair and Bill Clinton. The older ones among us will remember that. Communication became super important, right? And there was always talk about spin doctors. And I was, living in a small town in northern Germany, and I thought, wow, spin doctors, that sounds like a cool job to have. I want to be a spin doctor. Before that, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but this spoke to me. And I thought, okay, how can I learn to become a spin doctor? London obviously appeared on the map. So for the next couple of years, I tried to sort of move to the UK. And in the end, I managed to move to London, do my master's there in political science. Afterwards, moved to Brussels, became essentially a political communicator / lobbyist advocate, which was interesting, but too boring, both the city and the job after a little while. And I, moved into the car industry briefly. Corporate life wasn't for me. And then finally, easyJet called about 20 years ago and said, hey, Oliver, we need someone to help us build our continental presence in terms of communications. Would you be interested? I said, that's awesome. I have no idea how to do PR. I have no idea how to do internal communications, all these wonderful things. But I said, yeah, sure, I can do it. And they hired me. And it was a super fast, very pitch-driven, very communications-driven work environment. We built the business across Europe, 30 countries, built it pretty much from scratch everywhere outside the UK. And that was awesome. And I learned so much. And after 6 years, pretty burned out and ready to do the next thing, I set up my own business, moved back to Germany. And now I've helped probably 300 CEOs, founders, government leaders communicate better. I also work with thousands and thousands of leaders and organizations, large and small, and I do what I love. And I write books about it. I podcast about it. I have an academy. All of it is called Speak Like a CEO. And this is really the methodology I've developed over the years to help people speak like a leader, speak like a CEO, because it is often the big unlock, right? People get stuck in their career, in their lives, really, because communication becomes the bottleneck. And now when you look at the importance of communication since the days of spin doctoring, it's only become more important, even though we don't talk about it that much. We see it more as a given. However, LinkedIn said for the last few years, communication is actually the number one skill in business. It's what gets you hired. And this is even more true for people higher up the ranks. So for CEOs, the number one factor is what used to be called back in the old days, soft skills. Essentially how to get things done, right?
Right.
Because as a CEO, you don't say, okay, what do I need to do to fix this? When people bring you problems, they say, who do I need to talk to? And that's really what leaders do. They talk to people internally, externally, financial stakeholders, and that's what I help them with.
Fantastic. And we will come on to all of the Speak Like a CEO stuff, because just reading through the course syllabus,
Mm-hmm.
it's all of the things that we talk about on this podcast, which is great.
Indeed.
Presenting and commanding a room and storytelling and all of
Yes.
these good things. But let's stick on easyJet for a
Mm-hmm.
minute, because I think, I love a good story, and I think you've probably got a few about easyJet. But
Yeah.
tell me a little bit first about when you joined. What was the company like, and what was the challenge that you were set to achieve?
The challenge was to convince people that this is a new, better way of flying, right? Because people were used to the British Airways, Lufthansa, Air France way of flying. It's quite fancy, it's quite expensive, and the price is what it is. There was no dynamic pricing or anything like that. And it wasn't really affordable for a lot of people, certainly not to do this on a regular basis, right? So the challenge was to convince people, hey, you get a good deal, it's safe, and actually it's a better way of traveling. And you had to do this in all these different countries. And while people always like a good deal, they always want to be safe and comfortable, each country is really different, from the language to the culture to the incumbent airline. And these airlines, they were fighting back, and they have a lot of friends in governments, right? So there was a lot of persuading people, essentially borrowing from the Richard Branson playbook of you tackle the incumbent, you basically attack them, you have a strategic enemy. What you do then is to ensure that the customer sees that you're on their side. You fight the consumer's corner. And that was always our compass, our mantra. And when I joined, it was pretty rough and tumble, right? It was
Right.
already listed, but it was very much still a startup spirit of, I got so much responsibility in my 20s. Crazy. Wouldn't have happened in any other company,
Yeah.
certainly not in the corporate world. But I thrived on that. So I really, really enjoyed this. And on the first day, you come in, you're young and eager, you're a bit of a people pleaser potentially.
Yeah.
And my boss said, look, you work for a low cost airline. That means you have to say no to pretty much anything, right? And
Right.
that was a massive shift because our press office, the comms department, was relatively small, and you get inundated with requests, right? People want to speak to the leaders, to the CEO, to the COO. People want free flights, of course,
Yeah, of
all the
course.
time. Hey, I'm a journalist. I will, mention you in my report. I want to do this. Can I come? So interview request, free flights, all sorts of goodies. Hey, can you do this for me? Can you do that for me? And you have to be quite brutal while being polite and say, I'm afraid we can't do this. That was such a massive shift, but I'm glad I went through this in my 20s to see you have to say no to almost everything.
You've just unpacked so much there. I'm just going to go back slightly. Let's talk about something that I haven't talked much about on the pod, actually, which is fighting the incumbent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because I think, especially in the business world, you know, it's not the right thing to do to even mention a competitor often in the
Mm-hmm.
pitch, or at least that's
Yes.
the perception of it. But tell me more about this aggressive fighting the incumbent, because it sounds like your challenge wasn't necessarily convincing consumers. Because I remember when easyJet came out and they were doing £1 a flight or
Mm-hmm.
something like
Yeah.
this. I
Fly
was
for the
convinced
price of a
by that.
jeans. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
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 So the challenge was actually the competition fighting back more than anything, was it?
Yes, that was a big part of the challenge. And you had two competitors in a way. You had Ryanair, so EasyJet and Ryanair was,
Right.
always yes, on the paper were competitors and still are, but actually they went separate ways in a way. China went to like small airports, easyJet went to the bigger airports, and that's where we fought the incumbent. And that strategic enemy, picking that strategic enemy, has a couple of advantages. First of all, it rallies the troops inside. In some companies, people fight each other, there's silo thinking, etc. Not helpful. So we made sure the enemy was outside. Secondly, from a consumer's perspective, this contrast makes the choice very clear. When we say, we are cheaper, we have new aircraft, et cetera, that makes it very clear. Also, essentially, the big airlines were ripping people off because they didn't have competition in many of
Right.
these markets. Monopoly airlines or former monopolists, protected by their transport minister, protected by the local airport, which is also regional monopoly in a way. So all of that are working against us, but yet, bringing in so much traffic, bringing in so many tourists, bringing in jobs, that of course also helps sway. So we could talk about these things, but we had to make it clear that there was a clear choice between, the past and the future in a way. This is the way
Yeah.
to do it. And what confirms the success of the model is that all the other airline adopted the easyJet model, essentially. Picked the same aircraft, using the same operational model, dynamic pricing, unbundling of pricing, all the things from the low-cost airlines, they are essentially how we all fly across Europe. Doesn't matter which airline you pick. The model has proven to be more profitable and better for the customer because in the end of the day, you can pass on these lower fares.
And I know there were a couple of fairly interesting situations here, and there's a story about Sardinia, I believe.
Yeah, yes. So, fighting back meant, for instance, taking on, very profitable hubs. Milano, for instance. And Milano in Italy to Sardinia was a very profitable route. Lots of Italians go there, rich Italians from northern Italy would fly there on their holidays. Cool. We thought, let's go in. That's a great route, right? And in the European Union, you're allowed to fly from any point to any other point as a European airline. And Britain, of course, was part of the EU back then. So European airline, European route, legally, not a problem. However, the Italian government managed to get an exemption for this route. And they said, no, this is such a thin, remote island, thinly populated, thin route, very poor, etc. They need the support. Imagine a remote Scottish island. This is what these exemptions are for. No one in their right mind would fly there as a commercial airline. So the government is allowed to say, this is critical infrastructure. We give you some money. We protect you. You're the only ones flying this route, but you have to commit to do it every day. Something like this exists, right? But not on something like Sardinia to Milan. But the
Right.
Italian government said, no, this is what it is, right? This is an exemption from the rule. And what we did was to say, essentially put them on the spot and say, we're not going to accept this. We're going to open the route, lobbying the European Commission to, give them a slap on the wrist and say, you can't abuse EU laws like that. Didn't happen, as you can imagine. So the day approached, we had sold all these seats, and we were at the airport and said, okay, if we can't fly, let's make a big song and dance about it, right? Let's get people on our side. Like, we want to fly you cheaply, but they are not allowing this to happen. But then the Carabinieri turned up and essentially said, if you don't leave now, we will arrest all of you guys.
Wow.
At which point we said, okay, you win. We went on the aircraft, empty, flew to Sardinia, and had an impromptu press conference in the Olbia airport, flew back and had another impromptu press conference in Milan, which was good fun to do.
Yeah.
We'd also, in the meantime, offered to fly all passengers for free.
Wow.
To say, hey, okay, if you don't allow us to sell these tickets, we just give them away for free. I mean, the PR was great, but they wouldn't budge. But a few months later, it happened, right? Because the EU, also because of the song and dance we created there, the publicity, they got involved and said, hey guys, you can't do this. This is an abuse of a law that is to serve remote islands, not main tourist hubs, right? So that was quite nerve-wracking. It was good fun because we could be creative and think, okay, how can we get the public on our side and rather let them fly for free than cancel the flights, which people would have us blamed for, we thought. But at the end of the day, it took a little longer. But yeah, it was. I'm glad I didn't have to spend the night in jail.
Me too. In my view, that was a pitch, and it was a great pitch, and I'm sure you've got a lot of examples. But let's just dig into this because this is interesting for me. What's your definition of a pitch, and what can it entail, I suppose?
A pitch, as we often think about it, is either a group of people in a room with the PowerPoint slides, or it's the dreaded elevator pitch, where it's two people and it's very clear, oh, I want something from you, and maybe I can convince you with my words in the next 30 seconds. Cool. Those exist and they have their place. Now, most of the time, for me at least, a pitch is a conversation, human to human, between often two people who are on a mission, right? They have a conversation with a mission. And the question is, do our missions align? That is really the question. And I found that to be quite helpful to move away from this salesy pitching, which again has its place. But most of the time, hopefully, people are pre-sold by knowing you from social media, the podcast, books, etc. Probably the same in your case, and it's more having that conversation with a mission.
So have you got any good pitch stories? Maybe what's one of the best pitches that you've ever been involved in?
um, Come back to EasyJet because I think there's still a really good story there. You probably remember when that Icelandic volcano erupted in 2010, and European air transport was grounded for a week. Finally, we were allowed to fly again. Again, that was a lot of pitching towards governments and regulators. Like, come on, guys, this gets ridiculous. There's no danger anymore. The problem is that we hadn't pitched that to customers. Passengers weren't booking. So this was in spring 2010, and no one was booking for the summer season, which is where airlines earn all their money. So if the summer is screwed, you're screwed, literally, as a business, right? So all the airlines are, gosh, what are we going to do? So we had to come up with a really strong pitch to customers, to passengers. So what do? We had to show that there's no risk that this would happen again, that they could just book and be, not being stranded and enjoy the holidays. We created essentially a pitch around what was called an ash radar. We called it an ash radar. So some kind of mad scientist from Norway
Yeah.
came up with this thing, this device to be fitted on aircraft, which could detect an ash cloud, which meant that you could fly around it rather than through it. So that was one piece. We got the head of the UK airline regulator to join the press conference with our CEO and the scientist, and we had a jar of volcanic ash with us. That jar of volcanic ash explained in a way why ash is so dangerous. It's not like smoke or sand or dust. It's a very particular substance that could in a way glue together your turbines, which is not what you
Right.
want, right? Under certain, so because it's melted and then it's in the air and then it gets heated up, and that could lead to problems in the engine. So we showed them, look, this is the problem, and let them feel it and touch it and smell it. And
Mm.
that was great. The journalist was so into this, right? And then we pitched the idea of an ash radar, and it was reported everywhere. It was on every TV station, every newspaper all over Europe. And essentially that triggered people to rethink their summer holidays and come back and book with us and other airlines. So that was a great, I think, where everything came together, all the elements that helped people persuade to do the right thing from our perspective, because our assessment was this was solved, right? This wasn't a problem anymore, but perception in the public is often sometime behind the actual facts. It takes a while for everyone
Yeah.
to understand how things have developed. So that was very helpful to secure the business and, also help people to enjoy their summer holidays.
And I would suggest that those kinds of things, having props and,
Mhm.
wild ideas, that they don't have to be separate from the boardroom.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely right. And I think also people in the boardroom are pretty sick and tired of death by PowerPoint, right?
Right.
They want to hear a good story. They want to have, visuals, a safe presentation, short and visually engaging. They want to have, raconteurs in the boardroom. They don't want robots or ramblers. They want raconteurs. To me, that's the highest level of
Yeah.
speaking, level 3 in my methodology. That's where we should be. So absolutely. So this 20th century industrial age idea that PowerPoint is always the way to go. And the more robotic and the more jargon laden you speak, the more convincing you are. I think that maybe was successful in the 20th century. But with modern audiences, gosh, good luck.
Yeah. And the good news, I think, is that this is the bar, though.
Hmm.
I think certainly,
Yes. Yes.
certainly in my industry, that's what audiences are used to. They
Hmm.
prepare themselves to sit through hours of boring PowerPoints, but they've only got it to compare to the next person. So I think one of
Yes.
the things I often talk about is just doing something different, even if you're not
Yes.
raconteur level,
Yeah.
just something a little bit different. But let's talk about your process then. So You're very inspiring when you talk, and I'm sure people are listening and thinking, I couldn't agree with him more, but how do I get from where I am with a PowerPoint slide to this
Mhm.
mystical raconteur level of owning a room? What's the kind of
Yes.
process you would
Yeah.
go through?
So you and I are big believers in structure, and you, in your fantastic book pitch, you describe your structure, which I use now as well from time to time. And there are others, right? I have even written an ebook called 21 Storytelling Frameworks, which is essentially a menu that I choose from, depending on the situation. So you want to pick the right structure. And the key here is, do you start with a sledgehammer or an ice cream cone?
Mm,
Sledgehammer is something negative that punches you in the face and it gets your attention. The problem is that, if you want people to change something, change behavior, change habits, it's not a good approach because you prime them in a negative way. They're, oh, gosh, that is serious. So it's not great for change stories. It can be great to get attention on stage. It can be great if you have a solvable problem. It can be great if you're a startup pitching. And I wrote a whole book on startup communications and how they can pitch, etc. So it has its use cases, right? And then there's the ice cream cone, which is often best for internal audiences because you want them to feel good, right? Guys, the presentation or the project we just completed, ace. That was just awesome. Thank you. It would never have happened without you. Thank you. And if it's sincere, people say, oh, you know, my work is recognized.
yeah.
That is so important. And then you go on with your structure, which can be excite, disturb, assure. It can be, problem, solution, benefits, all of these things. I'm happy to share this with anyone. I share this freely. Maybe we can include a link in the
Yeah.
show
Let's
notes.
do it.
So that is one part. And then it's the human element, right? How do I tell a story around this? And as you said, it's the bar's relatively low. So can I talk about a story? And base my presentation, my talk on a story. So, for instance, yesterday I was working with a coaching client, and we included so that the talk she was about to give is about training, but teaching versus training, right? Teaching the old style classroom model, etc., whereas training. And we needed a story that shows how outdated this classroom model is if you want high achieving team in the knowledge sector, right? Because it's not really about passing on just knowledge. So we chose a story about the Prussian school system that was
Mm,
designed 200 years ago to create factory workers and soldiers, how that came to North America, and how that is still in use today to show people the contrast. And then we went back to Aristotle, who had a way more modern approach, right? So essentially, we took two stories from history to say, hey, we all grew up in this old industrious style model, which weirdly happened in Prussia to create factory workers, and the bell in the school is the same bell they had in factories. And you
right.
just make it really immersive and then say, okay, but Aristotle, actually going back 2,500 years, had a much better idea. And here it is to show people it's not just me having a new method here and trying to sell you my method, to say, hey, how we teach and train our people needs to evolve if you want to be successful in 2025 and beyond. So think about a story that you can use. Another example would be Le Mans and how Ford failed at the Le Mans race in the 1960s, even though they had the best cars and the best drivers and
Mm,
everything, but they weren't acting as a team. And then a few years later, they came back, same drivers, same car, but they acted as a team and they won. So you can use examples from history or just little stories, encounters you've had with a client, with a customer, and include this. And ideally, you start with the story because that gets you the attention and that also creates the emotional connection, right? People then care more before you go to the logical part because that's how our brain is structured. You go from instinctive to emotional to logical, and you want to take your audience on a journey through these three stages.
and a question I get is, you've given great examples of stories there, and when you hear them, oh, that's brilliant. Oh, that makes so much sense. And then people go to write their own presentation and they just think, I just have no idea what story to tell. I
Mhm.
can't think of a story. I don't know where to start. What's your kind of process for ideation for
Yeah.
coming up with the Prussian school system or whatever, the Le Mans example?
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes it's the clients, right? It's not all me coming up with all these stories. They have the idea or at least the beginning of a story, and then we riff off each other. So doing this not alone is usually a good idea. Secondly, you can use ChatGPT, of course.
Hmm.
Yeah, or any other LLM, you can use that as a sparring partner because it knows a lot of stories. It's not necessarily great at telling them and the story structure, so it would be double checking that. But just as, oh, there's an interesting idea. I usually get my stories from books and I collect them. So a lot of books have a lot of stories in that, and some are just great and they stick, and I make a note and say, hey, that is a good story, and this is how I came across the Prussian school system as well. And I would invite everyone to do the same. Admittedly, it's super difficult to come up with stories on the spot that resonate. Right? It's usually not our forte. Some people can do it, but most of us, mere mortals, we have to collect them. So become a story collector. When you encounter something interesting, and it can be quite mundane, it doesn't have to be volcanic ash grounding Europe's air travel, right? Those things happen once in a decade usually. But the interesting stories, the encounter you had at the airport, the encounter you had with a customer, something you saw in the paper or the news today on social media, just make a note and put it somewhere in a swap file or in an Excel sheet or somewhere. Just collect them. And then you go back and say, okay, I collected 20, 30 ideas. This one actually works quite well. So become a story collector because it is difficult to do it on an ad hoc basis.
And I think on that, it's okay to steal as well. Steal's maybe not even the right word, because
Yeah,
I
still like
hear
an artist.
story
Yeah.
exactly. I hear little snippets of stories from people like yourself, and I'm already thinking
Mm.
I could use that Ford example in a pitch that I've got coming up. And that's
Totally, totally.
okay.
It
That's
doesn't belong to
okay.
anyone. It
No,
happened. It
exactly.
happened 50, 60 years ago. It
Yeah,
happened. It's
yeah.
it's out there. Yeah. And the British rowing team, you're probably aware of that, right?
I
Does it make
yeah.
maybe I got this from your book. Does it make the boat go faster? So stories like that are just great. So from sports, from history, right? All of these work pretty well usually. But always considering the audience, right? If you're an audience, they're into sports, usually is a good point to
Yeah.
start. American basketball teams is also that's a classic
Yeah.
as well, right? So people tend to come back to those stories as well.
And I would add, Aesop's fables, Greek mythology, those
Oh
kinds of
yeah,
stories
yes,
all have
yes,
a moral, and if you can find a moral that aligns with the message you wanna communicate, it could be really
yes.
powerful.
Yes, and then you can give it a modern twist, right? So Aesop's fable, I saw on social media someone had an actual race between a tortoise and a hare, and they actually filmed this. So you can find a modern twist and bring
Yeah,
modern technology to the game if you want to.
fantastic. Okay, so you're gonna open your pitch with a fantastic story that makes an
Yes.
emotional connection, lands your point. What are you gonna do next? Say you've got half
Yeah.
an hour to an hour to present to someone.
Yeah, exactly. So ideally, you've prepared it in a way that you don't remember the words, right? It's not a script. You remember, or I advise people to remember the very beginning and the end, right? You want to go straight in with your story, and in the end, there should be a clear closure and call to action. The middle, you just stick to your structure. So you don't remember the words. You don't memorize the words. You remember the points you want to make. So if you have a slide, the key message is obviously the headline in the headline. And then maybe you've memorized, okay, I want to make 3 points here. And then I have a bridge to the next slide, which is such and such. Usually it's not hard if you practice it for a few times. None of that is a secret or anything anyone couldn't be doing. Anyone can do this, right? Just start with the story, use one of the structures you or I recommend all the time, and then have a good call to action so it's clear what's happening. Now, if we take a step back, like what's my compass, right? For me, it's a couple of things. First of all, be cool, then be helpful and be flexible. What does that mean? So be cool. And someone recommended this to me because I think this neediness is very off-putting, right? If people are needy or come across as needy and salesy, I think
Yeah.
it's off-putting. So just be a little cool, not too cool because you care about the other person, right? You want the business or you want to get your idea across. So don't be too cool, but be a little cool. Let's say, hey, we're two people on a mission. Let's see if these missions align. I would hope so because I'd love to work with you, but I don't come across as needy. So be cool. Then be helpful. And it's this old saying from sales that everyone wants to be helped, no one wants to be sold to. Everyone wants to be helped, no one wants to be sold to. What does that mean? So, for instance, when I pitch in calls, so people are interested in working with me, right? businesses or individuals who would like coaching or advisory. So what I do is not to have a script and follow a script and ask scripted questions and et cetera, et cetera. What I do is, hey, I'll tell you quickly who I am. Then I would love to hear from you and we see how I can help you. And if someone, let's say, just mundane thing, oh, my LinkedIn isn't working, or I think it's broken, or whatever, say, okay, cool, let's look at this. Or someone says, a startup founder says, hey, my pitch deck, I showed it 20 investors, no one's biting. What's the matter? So, okay, cool, open it up, let's look at it. So rather than talking about what I could do, I just help them.
Mm.
And that shows them A, that I'm credible, I know what I'm talking about. B, they're getting immediate value. And C, they experience how it would be to work with me. And some people like my style, some people don't like my style, and that's cool. And so we can select each other in and out. So it shortens the process. Everyone gets value. It's good fun. And you don't encounter the problem called reactance. And we can go
Mm.
into that as well. But that is very important when you pitch. And the last one is be flexible because you don't know what's happening, right? There will be technical problems. You're in a traffic jam. There's chaos at home because the child's sick, whatever, right? So I'm a big believer in anti-fragile communication where you don't expect that everything will go to plan all the time. You just accept that things will go wrong and you just take them with a bit of humor and you confidently continue as good as you can and just accept you do as good as you can given the circumstances. That's all we can do anyway. Be flexible also means that I don't stick to my script or my slides. And if someone jumps in and says, I don't get this, then no, wait. You explain it. You make sure that you hear what people are saying, the questions they're asking, and you just be flexible because, as you know, pitch never survives first contact with the prospect. So you always have to be a bit agile and adapt to the situation. So that's how I approach things. Be cool, be helpful, be flexible. And that has served me quite well.
So let's talk a little bit about anti-fragility, because I
Hmm.
think perhaps not everyone understands it, but it's the middle ground essentially, isn't it, between
Yes.
something robust that cannot move and something that's fragile that can fall apart. You want to create something that's not fragile, anti-fragile, but
And
is
it
not
gets
set in stone.
stronger. Yes,
Yeah,
exactly. So you can contrast it with optimization. Optimization obviously or often leads to fragility. So if I don't have my morning routine, my day is screwed, right? I've optimized my morning, but something goes wrong. It rains or whatever. Oh, this is impossible. My day is screwed, right? So in a way, you become more fragile because you over-optimized. So nothing against optimization. It's a good idea to an extent. At some point, it turns into fragility, in my view. So I believe that anti-fragility is essentially, or how it's defined commonly, is that um, pressure makes it stronger,
right.
right? And that allows you to build more confidence. So let's say if you just take it in your stride and say, okay, the tech doesn't work, or they cut my presentation from 30 to 10 minutes or whatever it is, and you just say, good, that's fine, deal with it, right? And that confidence actually makes you stronger and you appear as more confident, as more competent, as more likable, rather than making a scene. So what do you mean my slot's been cut by half? That can't be because I prepared it that way.
Right.
So that anti-fragility is to me is a good goal to have. I'm not saying never. We all lose our nerves from time to time. Sometimes just so many things go wrong that you're like, oh my god. But it is good to work towards that rather than having an optimized approach to communication, in my view, because it never. Often there are things you can't control, so you can either fall apart or get stronger.
So that's a mindset shift.
Hmm.
Is there anything you can do to prepare to
Hmm.
be anti-fragile?
Yes, you can think about what do I do when that happens. And
Mm.
that starts with little things like having an extra charge or extra cable or not expecting people to show up on time. So, for instance, if you have a 30-minute slot, you don't have 30 minutes of content. You maybe have 10 minutes of content or 20
Yeah.
minutes of content. You know it's going to start 5 minutes, or you think it could start 5 minutes late. Um, if you say, okay, if I only have 5 minutes, what would I say? And the way I do this, I build from the short to the long. So when I pitch, whether it's a book or whatever it may be, right? I start with a very short, the one sentence, then a paragraph, then a page, and then you build from there. So I always have my plan on a page. I don't need anything else in a way. Like you can easily remember that those few points on a page. A lot of people in business do it the other way around. They start with collating everything they think is important, could become of it, and then they start editing. Now, the disadvantage there is that it takes a long time to get to the final result. You have to chisel away until you get the Michelangelo's David rather than building it up, right? So that takes a long time, and it doesn't help you in terms of anti-fragility because you never thought, maybe potentially never really thought about what's that one paragraph I need to get across? What's the key message?
Mm.
It's somehow hidden. And I talk a lot about the controlling the 10%. Now, studies show that 90% of what you say will be forgotten by next week. If you're lucky, people don't
Yeah.
listen to you, then nothing sticks anyway. But so if you're lucky, people remember 10% next week. That means you want to be very clear what your 10% are. And that's where I would start. And the rest is just to support it, right? The supporting arguments for your 10%. If you start with 150% and then just about manage to get it back to 100, now there's no room for, or often that step is missing to say what's actually the 10%. So when your slot is cut from 30 to 15 minutes, you panic because you don't know which 15 minutes are really important. So you can actually do a lot, not just a mindset shift and just welcoming it. You can actually, in your preparation, design it to be able to do it in 30 seconds, in 5 minutes, in 15 minutes, whatever is needed.
So here's a follow-up question to that. If you identify what 10% you want your audience to remember,
Mhm.
and if everything does go to plan and you've got your full allotted time, how do you make sure that they remember what you want them to remember and not another part of the 90%?
It's never guarantee, but there are a few things you can do. Make the key message the title, right? So that is what people usually, the headline. As we know, it used to be said that in newspapers, most people just leave the headline. So the headline is number one. So that needs to be the key message, not the topic. The headline can't be Q3 update.
Right.
It needs to be Q3 on track, if that's
Yeah.
the message, right?
Yeah.
Then obviously, you want to make sure that every key message, if you have slides, is anchored in the headline. You want them to be visually and potentially immersive, right? So if the message is this volcanic ash is dangerous, show and tell. So you can use more senses. Easy to do if you have a GIF, a video, visualization, right? Rather than just throwing words at people. You can also ensure that there are not too many words on each slide, or just not too many words spoken, but that you reduce the number of volume so it is clearer what is noise and what is signal. And then it's the delivery, right? So a very easy trick is to pause before you give a key message.
Mm.
What you often hear is this sort of monotonous monologue. People talk and this drone and it goes on and on and on. It's very hard to discern what's actually important and what isn't. You can help the audience by essentially vocal variety. And could do that with pitch, with pace, with pauses, and pauses are very powerful. So for instance, I can talk very quickly because I want to get through this part, which isn't essential, but now I'm approaching my key message. And when I talk about my key message, I pause and I deliver it with my voice and my gestures, essentially the whole body language. Again, it's really easy to do. You just pause for 2 seconds before your key message. And everyone's like, oh, this is important, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good, got it. So that's an easy way to do it. So it's visual, it's the words you use, but also how you deliver.
It's so simple, but it can really make the difference between what they remember and therefore winning or losing in
Absolutely.
incredibly high stakes
Yes.
situations. Yeah.
Yes. It's not hard to do. It's just, okay. And then ideally you film yourself and you see how you do it. And then you pick one thing you want to improve, right? And you can just use your smartphone and take 5 minutes. And if you take 5 minutes every day, gosh, you make a huge step in 30 days.
Yeah. Yeah. So let me just go back to one other thing that you mentioned, the word reactance. Talk to me about that.
So reactance is a concept from psychology, and it describes a gut feeling we have that says, oh, someone's trying to manipulate me. I don't like it. And that, of course, is the opposite of what you're trying to achieve in a pitch. How does it happen? Well, I'm aware of 20 psychological triggers, and they are used quite frequently, especially marketing and sales. Things like urgency, scarcity, appeal to status, liking, things like that. Nothing we wouldn't have heard.
Mm.
Often people cram as many as they can into a sales pitch. And I give you an example. Yesterday, someone cold called me, and the sales guy on the phone said, "Hey, I'm from such and such company. I want to help you get more customers." And I said, "No, thanks. I don't need your services." And he said, "But do you not need more customers?" And clearly he was reading from a script, and it was clearly to trigger my FOMO. And, that's why I ended the conversation,
Yeah.
of course. But
Yeah.
you get the gist, right? They're very bad sales scripts, which are just stuffed with these triggers. And we're just, oh my God. For another example, and this was for high ticket mastermind, so very expensive. And this person pitched it to me and said, "Okay, yeah, it's interesting." So, and in the end, she said, "Would you like to pay the full sum now, or would you like to pay in monthly installments?" And I hadn't said yes.
The assumptive close.
Yes, exactly. And I said, "Really?"
Yeah.
So that is reactance in a way. You want to close, but the other person feels manipulated or thinks, okay, then they're not playing at my level. This is not helpful to me, right? And this is so reactance is something we sometimes have to live with. It's a thin line, and I think it comes back to knowing your customers. What does the person know, feel, and what's the level of experience? So in sort of, let's say, in mass advertising, mass digital marketing, these psychological concepts can be used quite successfully. So they are useful, absolutely. But especially when it comes to higher ticket items or consulting or, bigger deals, the people on the other side will be as sophisticated as we are. And we just have to be very careful not to do it, I think. We have to be rather, as I said, be cool, be helpful, be flexible,
Mm.
and see if our missions align and go in that with that mindset. The countdown clock is another example. That is urgency. Countdown
Yeah.
clock, right? It's visualized urgency. That's why I think cohorts work quite well, because, hey, we're starting on this date, either you're in or you're not in. That is a natural form of urgency that makes sense to the other person. It's starting, it's live, I should be joining before, or I missed the boat, right?
Yeah.
Totally fine. But artificial urgency is like, for what reason is there a countdown clock? Just because you think that will trigger me to buy.
Right.
And does the person then think, oh, I want to buy, or does the person think, oh, terrible,
Leave me alone.
leave me
Yeah.
alone, right? That's the difference between making the deal, the close, or people going away and thinking, what a douchebag, right? So that's
Yeah.
the difference.
And I think that goes for many aspects of a pitch.
Hmm.
Are you being sensational in any
Yes.
prop or message or visual or
Oh,
video,
yeah. Yes.
or are you being genuine? Because if you're not being genuine, then you might as well not bother with it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Exactly. Exactly.
Now, you also mentioned quite rightly that sometimes everything really does go wrong. And you can be as prepared and anti-fragile as you like, but stuff does go wrong. And it's hard to really say what to do in those situations other than try and be cool and calm and carry on, like you said. But my point here is that I think that fear of things going wrong is why a lot of people really hate to present or
Oh, yes.
pitch.
Yes.
And I know, you've spoken to hundreds of leaders on your podcast and in your day to day. What's the best advice you can give to someone who is a nervous presenter who can't sleep for nights the week before, all of that good stuff which we hear about all the time?
Yes. There's a great quote, I think, by RuPaul, who said that your fear of looking stupid makes you look stupid.
Right.
And that's not something I would tell someone is not helpful, but I think this is important to remember, right? That our fear is counterproductive. Now, what do I do about it? I've developed this method called BMW. It stands for body, mind, and words. And what we experience in these situations, which almost all of us experience, is a physiological reaction. So your body tells us this is uncomfortable. I don't like it. Let's remove ourselves from the situation. But we can't. So the fight or flight reflex continues. So we have to essentially learn the skill of resetting our nervous system. And we can do this through sighing, through breathing, through motion. And again, there's no mystery here. We can all look up certain breathing techniques, but just a little sigh can help. So if you do this, for instance, you can also practice this quietly. I sometimes do this at home. I do this at the
Yeah.
office. Sometimes just that email and you breathe,
Yeah.
breathe.
Yeah.
That's one part. Motion is another. So you can jump up and down like Tony Robbins if you need more energy, or you can go for a walk around the block quietly by yourself if you want to calm down. So body is one thing. And then the mind, only then should we address the mind. Otherwise, we can't talk ourselves out of nervousness. We have to do the physical work first. Our a mindset shift that's super useful is to shift nervousness to excitement. There's a good Harvard study that shows that that is actually very effective. And it's effective because in our brain, apparently these two areas are basically identical, right? So what feels like nervousness can feel like excitement. So telling ourselves that is very useful. What we should never do is tell ourselves, oh gosh, I'm so nervous about tomorrow's presentation.
Right.
We should actively reframe it in our minds. And then the words, and this comes down to actually, you have practiced, you know what you want to say, you thought about the questions that may come up, because you need that confidence for the rest to work and for the delivery to work, right? If you underprepare, if you try to wing it, yeah, you will probably be nervous and there's not much you can do about it because there's no evidence that you can succeed tomorrow. So it comes down to preparation, knowing your words as well. So body, mind, and words in that order, and that will help you to ace your pitch tomorrow.
I like it. And that's interesting because I've done a lot of research into this, and actually the order of it is not necessarily something that's spoken about very often. We
Mm.
hear about, here's 10 techniques in no
Yes,
particular order.
yes,
And
that's
so I
right,
think
that's
that's
right.
interesting
Yeah,
because I think if you breathe right, my understanding is that your heart beats slower, and there's nothing you can do to change that. Breathe slower, heart beats slower. Breathe faster,
yes,
heart beats faster.
yes. And ideally, you breathe out more than you breathe in.
Hmm.
So the idea used to be said that take a deep breath. Actually have to breathe out a lot. Why? Because there's too much CO2 in your bloodstream and the oxygen can't get into the bloodstream. It's basically blocked. That's my understanding. I'm not a scientist, but that's my
Yeah.
understanding. That's why just deep breath doesn't necessarily work, but deep breathing works. Essentially focus on the exhale, right? That's very important. So if you do that, more oxygen can go into your bloodstream. And of course, you want to try to not breathe shallowly up here in your
Mm.
chest, but further down, like diaphragmatic breathing as well. So again, it can be, I did lessons on that. I took some lessons on that because I had trouble with my breath. I'm slightly asthmatic, and sometimes this came
Mm.
through, and I talk a lot and talk very fast, and then sometimes it happens, right? It wasn't because I was nervous. It was just I was out of breath. So I learned some techniques and it really helps me. But all you need is basically watch some YouTube videos and
Yeah.
follow the advice. And I would say different things work for different people. There are many techniques that help people deal with nervousness. Just be reassured that almost everyone has them, has this issue, almost 85%, some studies say.
Right.
And there are a number of techniques. You just need to find something that works for you. So have a look at the BMW method, pick something, test it. If it doesn't work, go on to the next. And you will, over time, you will find techniques that work for you specifically.
That's right. I mean, there's no shortage of things that you can try in that field, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So sticking on the subject of when everything goes wrong, do you have any horror stories from a pitch that you've been involved? I love a good pitch car crash story.
Oh, yeah, sure. So let's embarrass myself. Years ago, I was speaking to a group of senior communicator, obviously wanting them to buy into my ideas and methodology about crisis communication. So I had prepared cue cards, which I no longer do, and you will see why. So I turned up on stage and they gave me microphone. So on one hand, I had cue cards, and one hand, I had a handheld microphone.
Oof.
And this was to project confidence about crisis communications, like really serious stuff. So I was fumbling with my cards and wait, hang on a second, oh, yeah, almost there. For me, it felt like an absolute car crash because everyone was just thinking, what a moron, essentially. What's he talking about? So that was super embarrassing. And I learned a few lessons that day. First of all, don't use cue cards, right? That's why I started to really get into structure, and structure is very easy to remember, very easy to understand for the audience, win-win. And the other thing is obviously ask what kind of microphone, how will it all work? So as you know, this is very important to understand the whole setup, including the tech, before you go on stage, before you enter a room, right? If you assume there will be a beamer and you brought your laptop and there is no beamer, what are you going to do? Show people your pitch on a little laptop and say,
Hmm.
can you all move closer to my laptop, please? You lost right there. So you always want to know what you can expect and be prepared for all eventualities. And yeah, let me tell you about another failure that I experienced. So I've written 4 books, and I
Yeah.
like writing, and I self-published these books because I didn't want to deal with publishers. But a few years ago, I had the idea, this is a book for a wider audience, right? Not just people, leaders and businesses, which is not going to be in bookshops anyway. Yes, let me pitch this idea to publishers, and got an agent. I had this pitch, and it was called Beat the System, because my idea was that, okay, I left the corporate world after 10 years and I figured out how to do things on my own, and there's probably lessons here to be learned. So we pitched this to quite a few people in the publishing industry, but all we got was basically silence and a shrug. And the publishing industry is kind of weird and very intransparent and slow moving. So you had more success than I've had, but essentially the pitch completely failed. As you know, you put a lot of work into this, right? You work on this for months to have a real strong pitch, but they thought it was too generic. I think that was my conclusion. That's kind of what they hinted at. It's kind of too generic. I still don't want to be discouraged from ever doing it again. I think there's a case to be had to be having a reputable publisher putting out your book. Certainly, there's strong advantages to that. So I'm not throwing in the towel quite yet. Maybe once I have a good, stronger, more specific idea, I will try it again. But yeah, pitching book ideas so far, no success for me.
What do you think the lesson is you can take away from that?
The lesson I took, so first of all, I spoke to the head of one of the biggest publishers in the world a few weeks ago for my podcast. They published 220 million book, Hachette, British guy, David Shelley. And he said about 1 in 1,000 is successful. And I wasn't even aware of these odds until now. So
Neither was I.
it is a very long shot. Like one
Yeah.
in a thousand series pitches gets published. So that's one thing to, okay, understand the math better, right? Probably. The other thing was that when you look at who gets published, an audience is crucial. And after my last book a few years ago, I started to consistently build an audience, right? On LinkedIn with a newsletter, because today, if you want to get published, either as a self-published, or if you self-published book that finds its audience, or go through a publisher, it does help to have an audience. So a lot of the authors you see, they have big audiences. So that is a lesson I took away. And it has the advantage that you can test your ideas, right? Everything I put out on LinkedIn, say every day, is an idea I can test. And I get feedback and it makes it better. So if I ever decide to put those in books, the stories and the methods have been tried
Yeah.
and tested, not just in my one-on-one coaching, say, but to a huge audience, not huge, but to a considerable audience, let's say, thousands and thousands of people, or hundreds of thousands of people each month. So that is valuable data. That is valuable information in terms of what people are actually interested in and what they're not so interested in. And things like pitching, presenting, public speaking, huge interest. Other things that may be a little more niche, but more obscure, less interest. Things that help businesses rather than the individual, also interesting, not so interesting. So people want to know, how can this help me rather than how can this help my business?
Mm.
And that indeed is a very important factor in pitching as well, that we always think about these two motivations, the internal motivation, the external motivation. Because I think a lot of pitching, a lot of businesses assume that it's all about the external. Oh, you want your business to make more money, right? That's your job as the procurement manager or that as the VP for marketing or whatever. Cool, yes. But there's also the internal. And the internal may be very different, and it's usually more important. So yesterday, I worked with a client on this because she struggled in a conversation with a big potential customer. She pitched it, but it came across as criticizing what they already built internally.
Mm.
And they, of course, immediately said, "Oh, wow." Essentially, the thought, you can read the thought, right, is you make us look bad. And it looks like I wasted company resources and I didn't know what I was doing if I let you come in here with your solution, which is admittedly better. So you have to be quite careful. How do you deal with that? I always think you have to honor the past. You honor the past by saying, hey, you built a great thing here. This totally serves you today, but let's look into the future. because
Right.
I think we can build on that. So honoring the past and giving people credit for what they've already done is so important if you pitch, but also in any change situation, right? If you want people to change internally, you have to honor the past.
I like that because, it's a big topic. Should we or should we not call their baby ugly when we all know it's really ugly? And actually, a reframe of honoring the past is a really
Yeah.
good little paradigm shift way to think
Yes.
about it.
I think it's important, and you don't want to call the baby ugly, but you also
No,
don't want to lie or mislead
right.
them. But
Exactly.
the choice of words matters.
So we've talked a little bit about the big pitching involving journalists
Hmm.
and huge corporations. We've talked about the boardroom as well, but you also work with founders and startups who are
Yes.
really needing to disrupt and make a name for themselves from
Hmm.
nothing. How does that differ in your approach?
Yeah, so the startup pitch, often we call it an equity story, is essentially a pitch that is designed to raise money from investors. And it has a certain structure. So you usually start with a problem, and then you show that the problem is huge, which means there's a lot of money in it. And then you show your solution, and then you go through the market and why your solution is better than anyone else's solution, the team, etc. So there's a well understood structure to a startup pitch with a clear outcome. Do they give us the money or don't? Now, investors are inherently skeptical, and their point of view is usually, we don't give you money unless you convince us otherwise. And as you know, 90% of startups fail, often because they run out of money because they can't convince enough investors, customers, top talent to go with them on this journey. So what I noticed is that often, because they follow this structure, what they say is relatively tried and tested. It's often not the challenge. It's more how they say it, especially in the early phases, because in the early phases, you don't have a lot of data or traction to prove that your idea rocks. So in a way, investors buy into the team. So the team has to be confident, but not cocky. And that is often this burden is put on people who are there for their technical, financial, engineering skills. They're not there because they're great communicators, usually.
Mm,
Sometimes they are. Often you have a team of founders where different people have different roles, right? But the investors want to hear from usually the founding team, not just from the CEO. They want to know there's not just one person. They don't want to invest in one person. They want to invest in a team. And often my role is, in addition to helping them shape the story, just make it sharper, to ensure that how they come across is confident. And a lot of little things can undermine perceived confidence. We say, okay, confidence on command. How do we do this? We talked about BMW. That's part of it. We talked about not memorizing a script, but remembering your points. And another factor is like really your body, how you deliver it, and your voice. Give you one example. I worked with a founder and they were raising, I think, 20 million. So it was quite considerable. But he always had this thing where his eyes went wide open because he had, I think it was subconscious, right? He had
yeah.
heard that this makes him look alert and interested.
Oh, so he
So,
wanted to do this
yes,
initially.
exactly.
Right.
When
Okay.
people spoke to him, do this, like eyes
Right.
wide open. I said, okay, and I film people because we often very good at self-correcting, but almost no one does it without a coach saying, hey, let's film this and see where you are. And he saw this and I explained the effect and he's like, gosh, I didn't know I was doing this. So relatively easy fixed. One example of what things that can happen. Your voice, obviously, you need to make sure that your voice is confident. Something uh, some people do is uptalk, right? So they raise their voice at the end of the question, at the end of the statement. So it
Yeah.
sounds like a question. And that makes you sound like you're not confident because rather than making a declarative statement, everything sounds like a question. Like, this investment is a good idea, right? Well, it should be, this investment is a good idea.
Yeah.
So again, easy to fix once you mirror people and say, okay, this is what it means and this is how it comes across. So it's what you say and how you say it, and also the energy you say it with. And there's often lack of energy. You've probably experienced this as well. So I often record people ask, hey, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your energy level? And they say, oh, 8 to 9, easy.
Yeah.
I was really feeling it. And you show to them, okay, this is really bloodless. This is a 4. And they then understand that it has to feel over the top for them to
Yes.
feel right for the audience.
Yes.
So those are a few things we look at, and therefore you know it can be many nuances, it can be many things, and in a way you want to improve all of these factors. So the whole picture that emerges is one of confidence and competence.
Now, let me just ask you a quick side note on something you said a couple of minutes ago about this structure of the investor pitch.
Hmm.
Everyone's used to the structure.
Yes.
Is it good or bad to disrupt by totally breaking the structure? Or is this an example of an audience who is praying you'll just give them the structure that they're used to?
It's a really good question. I think that completely breaking is probably not a good idea, but slightly innovating on it is
Mm,
a good idea. And the creativity curve of, 80% familiar, 20% innovative, which, this is familiar, but it's still kind of new. That is interesting. So that's how I would approach it, and that we do approach it. And just by telling stories often is already innovative, right? By
right.
telling stories, they're not just, oh, we spoke to this customer and Jim wanted to have, and then we said, we built this for you, Jim. Yeah, okay, but there's more to it, right? Often there's an origin story that motivates the founders. So I was working with one who raised millions in Silicon Valley, and he was building with his team a sustainability software that was helping businesses keep track of their sustainability goals, which is not easy because the data is maybe very widespread. And it wasn't part of his pitch, but say, why do you care about this so much? And then he talked about his childhood memories of diving, coral reefs,
Mm,
you know, being in nature with his family, and all of that. It became clear is the key to unlock his passion come investor pitch day. So we included that not as a long-winded story, but if people understand the why, the origin story, often it helps them to have more confidence in the person because they think, okay, this person cares about this. This is the opposite of the guy from business school who had a spreadsheet with 50 ideas and calculated the ROI and, just does this because it looks promising. No, this guy believes in the idea, so we can believe in him.
absolutely. And you can't help but show genuine passion if you're telling a story that you're genuinely passionate about, to state the obvious. So,
Exactly,
yeah,
exactly. It's not to be underestimated, right?
no,
And it's, if it's your story, it just rocks.
exactly. Now, you have interviewed hundreds of people on Speak Like a CEO, as I've already mentioned. This might be a very difficult question because that is many, many, many hours of
Mhm.
fantastic insights. But are there any guests or particular insights that really brought about a paradigm shift for you?
Yes. There are definitely. And out of these 300, I could obviously go on for hours because they're also
Yes.
amazing guests. You included, by the way. So we
Thank you.
talked about your pitch structure, which I took on board and learned a lot from. Two other examples. Matthew Dix, who's a master storyteller, wrote a number of books about storytelling. His definition of story just stuck with me, and I use it ever since. And it's a story is a tale of transformation. Because often the definitions you find out there are a bit long, hard to remember, and it's not necessarily clear what the difference is between a narrative story and an anecdote. But
Mm,
if you say a story is a tale of transformation, and you can extrapolate from that the ending is the opposite of the beginning, then you have something valuable. That's a valuable insight into story structure and the purpose of a story.
love that.
And it's a test, right? If you tell a story and say, hey, there's no transformation, or I guess that's an anecdote, then that's not really a
Right.
story. And
Right.
it's lacking an ingredient. So that was extremely helpful for me to understand this. Another one is Blake Eastman, who's the founder and CEO of the Nonverbal Group in the US, and he studies nonverbal behavior with technology. And he said, Oliver, the best communicators have range. I thought that was such an apt observation, backed by millions of data points, that we can all apply. And if people say, oh, well, that's not my voice or that's not my style, it's like the best communicators have range because maybe you talk to your, to the employees today, to a journalist tomorrow, to an investor the day after. Maybe it's all in one day. If you don't have range, if you speak to everyone in the same way, in the same voice, with the same metaphors, the same messages, you're missing something because, and I think we know this naturally, right? You talk differently depending on the audience and the context. And the best communicators, they understand the context and the audience that is in front of them, and therefore are able to adapt their communication style, verbal and nonverbal.
And if people want to go and listen to all of these wonderful podcasts or find out about the Academy or your books, where do you want to point them right now?
Yeah, so Speak Like a CEO as a podcast is on all the podcast platforms. We also started a YouTube channel, dabbling with YouTube, so I haven't quite cracked it, but hopefully we're getting there. I was very inspired also by your backdrop, so I painted this wall behind me a while ago.
Beautiful.
But it's not quite there. We're going to add some decoration as well. So your studio space inspired me. So LinkedIn, Oliver Aust on LinkedIn, AUST. I'm quite active there. Please connect, and you find everything from there.
All right. And the last question for this audience of people who just love knowing everything about pitching, just want to get better. What are your final thoughts, your final words of wisdom?
Final words of wisdom. Be cool, be helpful, be flexible. I think if you use that as your compass, you're already achieving more than 99.9% of people. So in addition to your structure, but I think that's the compass I'm using. And I think it's quite helpful to be helpful and to be flexible, but also, keep your cool while doing it.
Fantastic. Oliver, it's been an absolute pleasure. You are an inspiration, genuinely. Thank you so much for coming and talking to me.
Thank you, Danny. Much appreciated.
You have been listening to Pitch Masters with me, your host, Danny Fontaine. You can find me on social media, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Just search for Danny Fontaine or Pitch Guy for exclusive clips from behind the scenes and from the show. You can also find where to order my book, Pitch: How to Captivate and Convince Any Audience on the Planet, by searching on Google or visiting pitchguy.co.uk, where you'll also find additional resources and a newsletter to sign up to for exclusive content. As always, thank you so much for listening. Your support means absolutely everything to me. And feel free to reach out to me via my website as well. I absolutely love to hear great stories about incredible pitches. So, until next time, catch you later.